I'd like to talk to you about global warming, why it matters, what are the causes, and some of the possible solutions. Weather is what happens day to day and hour by hour, while climate refers to trends that happen over many years and even centuries. Here are average temperatures for the last 1,000 years. How, you may say, can you get measurements that far back? Scientists make estimates using things like tree rings and pollen counts. While temperature has varied, it has remained relatively constant uh, until comparatively recently. The red bit on this curve shows the recent measures, which show a dramatic increase in the world temperature. Storms are increasing in intensity and frequency, as well as forest fires. But the most concerning problem is the ice is melting. Ice is melting all over the world. Here is how much ice has melted over the last 50 years. Um, this amounts to about a rise of 1 meter in sea level, and this change is accelerating. Here's the kind of effect that can happen. Many cities that have been built in coastal areas are vulnerable, like this one. Now, if we look at this recent period to try to find out a reason for the cause of the increase in temperature, we find that the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has also increased suddenly over that period. The black line is the average, and the red line is the actual measurement. The annual cycle in the actual measurement is actually due to the annual cycle of leaves in the forest where the CO2 production of the trees slows down in the winter. The increase in CO2 contributes to the greenhouse effect on the world's atmosphere by causing it to warm up and melt the ice. So looking for possible solutions, you might say that we need to stop burning fossil fuels and drive electric cars. This is true and will help, but it is not the only thing that we need to do. Even these trucks can be replaced by electric trucks that already exist and are better in every way than their gas guzzling brothers. There are other renewables as well that we need to move to, like hydro, wind, and solar. Biomass, which is just another name for burning trees, is often counted as a renewable source of power, but it's not. Not only does this source release CO2 to the environment, it also takes a tree 40 years or more to grow, but it burns in seconds. Don't be fooled by people who say that this is a renewable source. Carbon on Earth has more or less been in balance with movements of carbon to and from the oceans and to and from the land. These processes are much larger than the contribution of burning fossil fuels. It is important to, as quickly as possible, reduce the CO2 caused by the use of fossil fuels. But it also is necessary to protect the larger processes from going off the rails. We need to do things to encourage carbon to be stored on Earth and on sea rather than in the atmosphere where they cause trouble. Roots, trees, peat, bogs are all places where carbon can be stored. Here are the relative amounts of each. You notice that above the line are the above the ground parts of storage, and below the line are roots and bogs and so forth. So you'll notice that peat bogs and forests, the trees in the forest are major um, uh, places where um, carbon can be stored. In a relatively natural environment, um, uh, carbon tends to, it moves back and forth in both ways, but on balance, it tends to move towards the soil. So it comes out of the air and into the soil. In conventional agriculture, it goes just the opposite. The carbon tends to be lost in this process, and doesn't come back. And so over a number of years, it can be totally lost, or a lot of it can be lost. In deserts, there's no biological activity, so they're not helpful in storing carbon at all. This only shows the soil carbon content, but it's instructive anyways, because what you see is the areas where there's large amounts of peat in Canada and in Russia have a large amount of the stored carbon. If we could see the forests, we would see large amounts in the forests of Canada, Russia, and Brazil. This is why these precious resources to protect, these are precious resources to protect even more than the reduction of fossil fuels, and that Canada has a large part to play. Drying out, this is why drying out and harvesting peat is a bad thing, as is clear cutting of forests and covering the land with asphalt and houses. Large parts of the earth have been turned into deserts. It was long thought that this was due to grazing cattle, but it is true, but not the way you might think. During prehistoric times, if you think about it, the large herds of caribou roamed the plains, as well as buffalo and wildebeest. So grazing animals have been around a long time, and during that time, the carbon was more or less in balance. So they can't be on their own the cause of the problem. The difference between then and now is this. There were predators that followed the herds and kept them in tight groups, picking off the one here and there, so that they they were allowed to roam freely. There weren't big fences for them to get stopped. So they could roam freely on large tracts of land and graze, so that they would move, graze for a while in one place, and fertilize it with herd poo, and then move on. And the grass would have a chance to recover from this. You can do this. There's a place in Zimbabwe, and the two pictures have been taken at exactly the same place, only 3 years apart. And the only difference is the one on the left was grazed just as if the cattle grazed as much as they wanted. So they took everything and left nothing but bare soil. And on the right, they were allowed to graze for a while, and then they moved on to another place, and then allowed to come back later. But the thing is, the one on the right was able to support a 400% increase in livestock numbers. So this is very doable and will improve the environment even with the cattle. Cattle are actually a help in this case. This is what happens to the grass. If the grass is cut right down to the nubs, then the roots become smaller. The grass takes longer to recover, and it's less healthy. So, and if the grass is allowed to be grazed, but to allow it to come back, then it has very deep roots, which are important for all kinds of things like retention of water, and the rest of the environment is improved by that. Now, this could be done in our situation as well. This is a farmer that from 1993 to 213, he has actually improved the organic matter in his soil by following a number of very simple rules. First of all, he doesn't allow mechanical disturbance, so he does no-till on the soil. He always has something on the top of the soil, like an armor, even if it's dead material, it's covered at all times. And he doesn't do monoculture. He uses diversity to make his crops more resilient. And he keeps living roots as long as possible in the soil, and he manages the animals much like the people in Zimbabwe did. Here is an example of what they do. These are new plants that have been planted in the stubble of last year's crop. This is a mixture that is more resilient and has a tendency to confuse the insect pests and makes a better managed environment, and the production levels stay up quite high as well. He does the thing with the cattle by making a series of paddocks with wire between them, wire fences between them, and he lets the sheep or cattle graze within one of these paddocks until the grass has had enough, and then they move on to the next paddock, and they just keep rotating around, and the sheep fertilize the soil as well as keep the thing from overgrowing too much, but they don't overgraze so that the grass has a chance to recover. So there is hope, but it is going to take a lot of work to save the earth from warming.